Hello everyone, today we talk about Theodosian history from the Battle of Siscia in 388 until Theodosius' death. A moment dense in events that actually stress both the importance of the federati policy, also the one of the essentially anti-Christian reaction, paganizing, could say, reaction in the West that had been more unstable and that had brought Theodosius, that was ruling essentially from Constantinople, to in fact dedicate a great part of his time after the Gothic question in the Balkans and the Sasanian one in the East, military attention in fact to the West, in which he had to fight to put down important revolts by usurpers or by this counter movements, and reaffirming fundamentally that unity that in fact in Theodosius was embodied for the last time, right, of the Roman Empire up until at least the Justinian era, but in a completely different reality and unbalance between East and West. And considering that this was also happening after the Edict of Thessalonica, that in 380, a city that would be theater years later of actually a massacre by the hands of the same Theodosius, for which he also met with an initial opposition by the Archbishop of Milan, Ambrose, etc. And that also shows in general in the means that Theodosius used how important the reliance on the magisterium of the army and the loyalty owed by these essentially Romano-Germanic leaders. Think about Stilicho, but here there are other figures that played in that sense. Think about Arbogastes or the same Gothic kings. So from this context and the various problems that occurred also in relation with the revolt of Thessalonica, where the local magister militum was probably Gothic origin was killed. Also Alaric's rise would take place, and starting from 387, the West had witnessed the rebellion of the usurper Magnus Maximus, who was a famous figure, would enter also in Celtic mythology. This was a general who had actually fought successfully against the Picts together with Theodosius before, and that had risen, in fact, from Britain, Gaul, right, to take over Italy and deal with Theodosius himself, even though Maximus' situation was more precarious, and this was played with some tricks that were also towards the Western Roman court, as we will see now, because Maximus had fundamentally negotiated and kind of tricked the East with the excuse of the barbarian pressure of the Danube, and had marched in Italy to Milan, where Valentinian II had to flee, in fact, away in Illyricum to Theodosius eventually, because Maximus had actually arrived with a much larger army that, in fact, would take over the land. Theodosius intervened, naturally, to protect the young prince, Valentinian. He defeated Maximus' forces at Siscia, Sisak, and Petovius. These are today some Croatian localities. The Battle of the Sava, essentially. And Maximus, at that point, retreated. He had tried some scheme, right, even trying to assassinate Theodosius. He had paid some troops, as we will see now, also to actually some of Theodosius' federati to ravage Macedon, rebelling to the emperor. But these were the means of the loser at that point. Maximus was defeated and captured at Aquileia in northeastern Italy on August the 28th, 388, and he was put to death as an usurper. Actually, his descendants remained in the local administration. He was, these were important figures in general, so they were in the elite. That you could kill them as responsible for their political actions, but in general their ties remained. In any case, the victory over Maximus restored the unity of the empire, because at that point fundamentally Theodosius controlled the entire situation. Valentinian would also die shortly afterwards. What, however, the war had triggered in particular was the power and the authority of the Gothic federati of the Illyricum, their commands, their troops. As you know, Theodosius, we never talked about that specifically, but he was the great vanquisher of the Goths after the great Roman defeat at Adrianopolis that had in fact brought also to the rise of Theodosius himself, and the entire Theodosian imperial policy and ideology and propaganda mostly revolved, in fact, around not just the victory, but actually the taming of the barbarians. This was the greatest achievement of Romanity in universal terms, right? So the Theodosius could boast that not just he had managed to settle the Goths in Roman lands and transforming them into Roman soldiers and peasants, but that in this sense he had shown the Roman ecumenic power and the transfiguring nature of the same imperium and glory, right, and transforming these Chthonic giants into true Apollonian, say, this point citizens is a big word, but still you'd say call them subjects in a way. This was the entire thing, also because the Goths naturally from that moment onwards objectively served en masse in the Roman army. They paid a huge tribute of blood, and so hence that loyalty and that sense that properly of trust that Theodosius had towards some Romano-Germanic leaders. This was the moment. Just in the east, we know of some problem brought by, let's say, a concentrated Gothic element in the units that never surpassed, however, the 30%. So the Goths were objectively assimilated, just, however, remaining for the first time like an entire people within, still and compactly so, within the Roman boundaries in the Balkans, in the northern part that, you know, was, as you know, had undergone greatly because of the same barbarian invasions and wars that had been waged along the frontier, kind of a depopulated land where, you know, urban civilization had declined. These were mostly settled in areas that had been once, you know, a bit of the pride of the Roman Danube, because basically they were the only urbanized and agriculturally florid areas along the Danube that the Romans also had in part conquered Dacia in order to protect it. Things had changed naturally, and in fact great part also of the Roman success in this sense was the ability of recruiting the Goths, whereas the Roman recruits were increasingly hard to find because of all the economical and demographic problems of the late empire. And during this war, of course, there was a serious thing, and by the way, shows as always that, you know, basically just 10 years after Adrianople, 388, the Romans were capable of fielding the same amount of forces that had before the defeat of Adrianople, and to defeat the greatest possible enemy that it could find. It is another Roman army that in West was also present. So the idea that the Romans suffered at Adrianople, at least, however, a massive blow for which they couldn't satisfactorily field other armies, other troops on their own, is excessive in absolute and relative terms, considering in relation to the Goths. But it's also true that wars cost, they are disruptive, and so in politically and militarily speaking, the Gothic federati settled in the broader region of the Illyricum were increasing in importance. Were becoming an ever greater problem that, as you know, later on at the beginning of the 5th century would be solved by sending them to the west, to Italy and to Gaul and to Spain eventually. So this is a bit how, you know, we talked about this in other videos, but we will keep talking about them. in the preparations against Maximus between 387 and 388, Theodosius had emanated a constitution that was easing financially at the detriment of the provincial taxpayers his Illyrian troops, including the federati one, because the constitution is emanated by Theodosius, and he talks about in lustris per Illyricum prefectura. We should assume from this that in 387-388 the Pars Orientis of the Roman Empire had by that point definitely absorbed this separate prefecture that still in 386 was to be found in the Pars Occidentis of the empire. This is particularly meaningful for a couple of reasons. First of all, it was evident that Theodosius, by easing the financial burden, because essentially the federati had to pay the empire in the same measure of the other inhabitants, right? This was usually done, in fact, in troops mostly, and these troops could not be also too much squeezed. At least they were favored economically, so that they could also provide functional troops, because fundamentally the trend, as you know, also with Alaric, would be literally to invent, and that had already happened, as we will see now with the incident of Thessalonica, to essentially confer the military magisterium, that is to say the command of the local army, to the federati, that in this sense were not much federati anymore, but they were actually seen in this ambiguous way as properly head of the local Roman army, that is to say actually of the annona and of the supply system that could in fact support the military of the same peoples that were peoples in arms, and therefore acting as if they had been properly the Roman army per Illyricum in that case. You know that Illyricum had been, generally speaking, also one of the least, say, civilized areas, like historically, where most, in fact, of the soldiers had come from. In the 3rd century, by the 4th, the situation had gone already down even for these local communities, and the Germans kind of filled in part those gaps. But at this point, literally in ways that, of course, the Romans would say they were, just governing on their behalf, but in practice they were still, say, an entire people is a bit deceitful as a definition, because there were still somewhat some scattered tribes without like much of a broader cohesion, but still the Romans themselves were the ones who were operating actually for electing a single ruler, a single leader to control them better. Hence also what the royal Germanic tradition, actually in Roman Germanic times, was stemmed from, with Alaricus, that was properly named Rex, but it was not the only one, because that was a title, of course, they would get from the Romans in Latin. In any case, it's also meaningful that this area, that of course had always had a great strategic importance because of the military nature of the Danube in general, and in fact and the other rivers that also flowed there, some strongholds that were controlled there. So the eastern half of the Roman Empire, that was factually just an administrative representation, there was never such a thing like two separate empires, theoretically speaking, were originally part, in fact, of the western half, and in fact the West would maintain even a part of them still also in later times. That would become kind of a frontier. Think about Pannonia, generally speaking, pertain to the West. Also in Ostrogothic times, etc. Those were controlled up to the Danube, to the north, all the Alpine block. In fact, that's also what the, from even an usurper from Gaul like Maximus had to take into account when trying to march into Italy. because the entire Alpine line was fortified and garrisoned. And with the control on this kind of more eastern part, like it would be Mesia Inferior, fundamental, roughly, and other lands, the eastern half could claim like some kind of better control, properly on the federati were settled there, but probably also an administrative legitimacy of the rule there. And this was not like it happened. It didn't happen overnight, but fundamentally from a certain moment onwards, like in this one, in Theodosius' constitution, it was claimed, but up to a couple of years ago, figured in other documents as the opposite. That is, that this land was pertaining to the east, not to the west. And it would stay like that, by the way, because of course the eastern part also would maintain a greater control on the Balkans in general. There were a more solid power, etc. So it was to be like that. Other gods would settle there later on, and so on. And in the relations between the barbarian soldiers and the provincial subjects were not easy. Actually, they were becoming ever more difficult, because the Roman subjects were noticing that Theodosius was facilitating the gods, while actually asking more to the Roman subjects, properly met. And this is what brought to the Thessalonica incident. Thessalonica was the capital of the Illyricum, and the urban population killed the supreme commander of the Illyrian troops, the Magister Militum per Illyricum, the barbarian Butarich, maybe a Goth, but probably a Goth actually, maybe even that Vitericus, that was Rex of the Ostrogoths, settled in the Illyricum, because by the way there were different groups. The majority were what would be called later the Visigoths, right? But there were, of course, bands, clans from other faraway places. It also witnesses how, kind of more important. In fact, we are on the eve of the Hunnic invasions, etc. So the Ostrogoths still had their own important Crimean power that was greater than the one of the Goths, that instead had kind of descended from Poland through the Carpathians into the Balkans, that fought eventually at Adrianople. In fact, there was an Ostrogothic cavalry. It was quite strong at Adrianople, next to the so-called, later called Visigoths, because the Ostrogoths were more powerful, more stratified, more, they had a greater command, high stratified society. In any case, this guy was put at the head of the same Illyricum, apparently, and he was killed by the inhabitants of Thessalonica. This had happened because there had been, as usual, some problem with the circus, with the races. A charioteer was accused of rape, and he was jailed by Butarich, and the mob got angry, and so there was this revolt, and the Germanic ruler was killed. So this was a very serious action, because it reflected definitely an anti-barbarian sentiment of the population of Thessalonica and of the Illyricum in general, among the Romans, that in fact could have the same consequences of the conflicts between Romans and barbarians that had brought to the incident on 377 and the defeat of the Roman army at Adrianople. So naturally, as we were saying before, the emperors had made, Theodosius specifically, had made this great effort to solve the Gothic question in the best possible way, and he had succeeded. considering that after all, the Goths had swarmed in imperial territory, etc. He had managed to maintain this balance, and he had ever more needed them for his wars in the east and in the west as well, as we've seen. So the killing of Butarich was as an insult to the same imperial policy and to the order of the empire altogether, as Theodosius had established it. And this was happening, by the way, in the east, in such an important city as Thessalonica, and not just in the west, where the situation was still precarious, as we will see. So Theodosius had to take very brutal measures. In fact, in May 390, he ordered the massacre of the citizens of Thessalonica. Certainly, Theodosius, as a fervent Catholic, gave the order with great pain, right? But he knew that the fedus with the barbarians seemed threatened by this insurrection, and he considered the fedus as something vital for the empire, as it was evident at that point. And this mechanism for which somebody from within the west, the east, was already kind of giving up was showed dangerously during the campaign against Maximus, when some barbarian bands, subsidized by the usurper, had started to sack Macedon. These were basically Theodosian soldiers, federati, that had defected or had simply moved from Illyricum south to ravage Macedon in coordination with the rebellion in the west with the rebel Magnus Maximus. So this was disturbing, and these core Mediterranean lands were important to preserve, if anything, first the stability. The as we've seen already, the tax incomes were quite few. At least Theodosius, for carrying out his policy, had to increase it among the Romanized population rather than among the Goths. So it was a very delicate balance that had risk to create even greater fracture. So, a 4th century Roman emperor that massacres an entire population, one of the most important cities, is an enormous deal. It tells you how serious the situation was. It was interpreted politically, and probably rightly so. Thus, it was evident now that Romanity, even if for raison d'état, had to be humiliated by an emperor as Theodosius, that had imposed the Christianity as the official religion of the empire, finally, without options, but who was, as a man, in deeply and of true and certain Roman spirit, had, however, had a passionate defender in Ambrose, that ex-consular administrator or governor of Liguria, that in the Milanese bishopric had brought thus the soul of the Roman functionary in love with the Romania, as it had already been named by the 2nd and 3rd century. This probably the land of the Romans, as would mostly apply to the Byzantine Empire later, as a kind of a broader, deeper identity, threatened by the barbarians. So it was obvious that even within the same ecclesiastical elite that had supported Theodosian policy in the affirmation of Catholicism and of Christianity in the first place as official religion of the empire, the massacre of Thessalonica was too much, right? And that this was evident by the degree that a rebellion had been sparked by the what was perceived as an excessive support to the barbarians properly, in opposition to Romanity itself, right? So in many ways, consider the Goths were barely Christian and in any case Arians. So, you know, the populace of Thessalonica was essentially Catholic, right? So this was also a big deal ideologically, and the church would take this in important consideration. You know that there would be swings still in kind of some sense in the East in favor of Arianism, because in part of also the same Gothic policy and so on. And like in similar cases, for example, 10 years later, in the same East, in the struggle of John Chrysostomus against the barbarian magister Gainas, the Goth Gainas, it would be in fact taken out, and we've seen this. We made several videos on that period. You can check it out in the late Roman Byzantine playlists. The Catholic episcopate hostility against the Arian barbarians had a great importance. In fact, behind that rebellion, there surely was some ecclesiastical support as well. As a consequence of the extermination, Ambrose excommunicated Theodosius, and he obliged him to penitence, after which the emperor was readmitted on Christmas of the same year within the communion. And the penitence of Theodosius in front of the Milanese bishop equated, however, to a disconfession, even if within certain limits, of the emperor's intolerant policy of fealty at all costs to the barbarian Frigidus. This can have brought to the discontent among the barbarians. As you know, the Frigidus, both for the Romans and the Germans, was historically a very important thing, because the Frigidus is based on the fides and on the pietas. So it's a religious pact, right? And here, the religion at stake was something that, again, up to a few years before was not even properly officialized from a strictly, in fact, religious point of view, where it had to be paganism or Catholicism or Arianism. So such great respect that Theodosius had towards the barbarians, because he knew that he had to keep them at bay and content, and the same barbarians weren't living, in paradise, right, in the Balkans. They still had to find properly a systematic settlement. They were still an unstable force. In fact, the consequences of these events probably brought to further destabilization, had all an impact on the imperial balance, because from one side you have this pressure on the frontier, and from the other side you have your population that is feeling mistreated and oppressed. And so let's say Theodosius' penitence represents an important affirmation also of the ecclesiastical power in the empire, to a point which the church was saying you don't have to compromise too much, in fact, with these barbarians. And as we will see now, there was some backlash in the same Italy, in the same western provinces, from the side of those true senators that had been very discontent of the enforcements of Christianity, and that would prefer to side actually with the barbarian military leaders then, let's say, properly agreeing to Theodosius' policy in a way. So the situation was that messed up, because in whichever direction Theodosius would have moved, he would have caused problems in the east or in the west, respectively. And that's in fact what would happen. It would put at risk the same balance of the empire. Just a strong personality and a capable commander, great leader indeed, as Theodosius, could control it. And it's possibly exactly because of the deference of Theodosius towards Ambrose of Milan that the Visigoths of Alaric in 391 rose. We're not sure about this, but they're more or less the same years, right? And Theodosius, by the way, was in Italy at the time, so this would be kind of some kind of evident connection with the absence of the emperor, with this kind of more attempted pro-Catholic policy. And that same revolt of Alaric would have been, in fact, tamed by the general of Vandal origin, Flavius Stilicho. Probably his mother was Roman, and this is interesting because, after all, the Vandals were traditionally hostile to the Goths, and there are also this kind of divisions among the Germans are very interesting to follow in Roman policy. And after which, after this revolt, Theodosius agreed with the Goths in 392 for a new Fedus. So in other words, the Goths had rebelled and had to be put down once again, and agreeing this other alliance. And it is very likely that in such Fedus, Alaric was recognized as new Magister Militum per Illyricum. In other words, he had been substituted to that Butharic killed in Thessalonica. As if to say, we've put you down, we give you this highest command to reward you as a leader of all these other gods, right? That was, in fact, not really, as we were saying before, Alaric's royalty eventually would be something very new in scale and importance among the Germans, that after that would try to emulate him, right? At least the elites, because the German freeman, the average German freeman, was surely not very thrilled by this. But that's in fact also how the Goths came to be the most Romanized, most hierarchically organized among the Germans earlier, because of this reason, with the way they had been properly settled within the Roman Empire and Romanized in these functions, in these posts. But again, defeat of Stilicho, that would have, by the way, however, still defeated the Goths many other times later, as you know, may have generated another crisis in the Balkans, while still Theodosius was in Italy, where he remained for a long time, from August 388 to June 391. So just after, the defeat of Magnus Maximus, he had remained in the country, and he would leave it only in July 391. This demonstrates that Theodosius felt deeply how the Western situation was unstable, and how thus necessary it was direct surveillance of the same Italy by him, considering the weakness of the young Emperor Valentinian II, that had been reinstalled in the Western court, but wasn't doing really great, and not for long. In fact, Theodosius was right about Western instability. Usually, the Gallic prefecture was the region that, because of the economical importance and generally speaking of the in fact, increased barbarian pressure also on the Rhine could cause government crisis. And this was evident. Gaul was the basically the richest, most important province at this point, at least. Well, maybe yes. Italy probably was richer in relative terms, but Gaul was bigger, and especially in terms of agricultural resources, was a very important supply. The prefecture of Gaul was the one that literally controlled everything from Scotland to Morocco, right? In terms probably of strategic, probably of high command, all the legions. So those who had to be in charge of this were the Western emperors from Italy, but the things were, as we've seen with these usurpers, etc., gone in another direction. The Western provinces were beginning to kind of fall apart in a way, properly from an internal point of view, because of the autonomistic instances and so on. And interestingly enough, only 11 months after Theodosius went away, Valentinian II was killed, or killed himself. We don't know. After a conflict against his generalissimo, the barbarian Arbogastus, who was a Frank, by the way, and had fought, by the way, in Gaul against Maximus' son and troops that had been left there, while in fact Magnus was marching in Italy and in the Balkans against Theodosius. Valentinian died, if not wrong, on May the 15th, 392. And the rebel Arbogastus proclaimed emperor a paganizing Christian, Eugenius. And there was this paradox, a very interesting one, for which, we said it before, which the pagan nobility of Rome, that had been extremely discontent of all the measures that the emperors had taken, removing the Statue of Victory from the Curia, having all this, the Senate of Rome at this point was very strong. Even properly the Christian presence in the city was somewhat emarginated. The times were changing, but they were properly the stock that embodied really the most aristocratic ruling class of the empire, right? The one recreated from Constantinian times. In Constantinople was a completely different thing. It was more like a bureaucratic nobility with some kind of standardized classical education, but also with some kind of greater Hellenic bias. The true people who actually studied as a motivation of life properly, and the embodiment of the same imperial principles and tradition were the Roman senators, people of enormous culture in the first place. And it's paradoxical exactly because of this, that such nobility that should have been also the guardian of the anti-barbarian tradition of Rome actually sided without regret the rise of the barbarian Arbogastus. And there had already been an antecedent, by the way. It was the friendship of the Frankish bout or magister militum of Valentinian II with the pagan Symmachus. The Symmachi and the Nicomachi, so the most radically noble families of Rome, backed thus the rebel, and it was the prefect of the Italian Praetorium, Virius Nicomachus Flavianus, the father, because there is also the son, distinguished from him, with an honorary iteration, let's say, because he had been prefect of the Praetorium, and probably together with another element before this revolt. And also the urban prefect Virius Nicomachus Flavianus' son. And one could be perplexed by this association, but it's actually very understandable. The vexillum of the anti-barbarian struggle had been waived by the Bishop Ambrose, that was naturally adverse to the barbarians that were either pagans, as Arbogastus, for example. It was not an Arian even, it was just a pagan, or Arians, as we've seen the other, especially the Goths, that had been Christianized earlier in larger numbers. And to the supporters of paganism surviving within the Roman nobility that were definitely not happy of Ambrose, also because of the further anti-pagan decisions that Theodosius had taken, such as the destruction of the Serapeum of Alexandria in Egypt at the hands of the Christian mob, didn't have any other option but, resting on the military dictatorship of a barbarian like Arbogastus. And we could even read more within it, because it's obvious that the idea of imperium was connected with actual military power. And the Germans had always been seen by the Romans in some kind of good savage fashion, for which, they were barbarians and all, but after all, they still had those kind of sense of honor, loyalty, of pride that were at the base of Roman identity in a military sense, and that the nobility especially thought that the Christian masses had degenerated, had humiliated. And this is a very interesting vision, because very often we have seen how Latin Germanic Europe, probably even after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, always had, even and eventually in its own Christianity, a kind of a very different attitude towards the East, towards properly not paganism, but let's say the Germanic culture altogether. And we cannot explain the Western fall as, the Germanic conquest. Nobody believes this in anymore. These were, the overwhelming majority of people, or the masses, were uncontrollably Roman. So that, the Germans were Romanized, Catholicized, began to write and speaking Romance languages everywhere in this land. So the question was, well, except Britain, but, that's another story. But it's evident that there was a consensus around properly the models and the ideology that even properly the Germanic leadership, mixing with the Roman one, was embodying on the wake of that had been kind of a more barbarian but mindset of properly of the West. I mean, even the Italics, after all, were not so distant from their own barbarity in the centuries. In that kind of bloody tribal Indo-European guys that had been great part of the same, if not the most important moral characteristic that brought the Romans to take over the world. So we will see this further, but we shouldn't be surprised by such machinations, because it was evident to the Westerners, as with the usurpers and everything, that now the Eastern Roman Empire was something else. The Theodosius was an Eastern emperor. That was kind of that it was impossible also to maintain the two sides together, as the same Theodosius recognized by splitting it by his will among his two sons. That two sides that would have, two halves that would have never practically been reunited, if not after the end of the Western one. So two different cultures, two different worlds. This was normal. Like in the West, the military changes were leading gradually to the necessity even of a dictatorial character of the supreme military magisterium that was normally also in the hands of barbarians, because in that situation it was more important to have a strong leader than a Roman one. And so even though these barbarians were actually Romans, because they were fully integrated in the game, these were not foreign kings of foreign peoples. They were literally, I mean, we say barbarians, but some were also literally of Roman descent, together with mostly the Germanic one. But they had risen through the ranks of the Roman military. They were Roman, right? So that's also great part of what Rome had been about since ever, right? Who was really Roman among the Romans traditionally? Rome always had more foreigners among its ranks than Romans, and the entire empire extended in that fashion. This also can be explained with the general depressive tendency of the demographic index that had rendered impossible, basically since the 3rd century, the traditional recruitment of only Roman troops. Of course, there were lots of probably barbarian units. The Notitia Dignitatum is from the same year to see how prominent symbols that were evidently connected also to the Germanic or the Celtic world really were, even though they were kind of more universal than we think. You find them even in Africa. But the point being that it was normal to have those origins, and we shouldn't really stress too much the boundaries existing between, I don't know, somebody born and raised in Germany from somebody born and raised in Gaul or born and raised in Italy at that point. Especially considering that the empire was still existing on that, to that extent. So, in any case, the points of reference were the Roman authorities and structures, right? The Roman army would go on for another century, functionally speaking. So, and that when it stopped is because the state had stopped. And in the Eastern Roman Empire, instead, still it was easier, probably in the Eastern Prefecture, to recruit Roman troops. But as we've seen, we've also noticed how waning the Gothic contribution was. In fact, also the Roman recruits were barely Roman in the East as well, meaning that they mostly came from the Oriental and Pontic dioceses. They were found in regions like Isauria or Osroene. Isauria was an island of barbarity within, millennia of civilization. They always remain isolated. This is important because it tells you also how much probably the Eastern, more kind of Hellenic world had mostly gravitated around cities and the coasts, as it would remain, in fact, from Byzantine Empire. Whereas the hinterland had remained somewhat detached from the mechanism. This is true in part also in the West by certain regions, but we're just talking about certain areas of Britain or Armorica or northern Iberia. But in the West, the Romans had kind of more properly impacted, also from an ethnic point of view, the land. I mean, Gaul and Spain spoke a Romance language already, not a Gallic or an Iberian one, respectively. So in the East, this didn't happen factually. In part, yes, in the Balkans, as we know, there is an important Romance legacy, but I mean, in the hinterland was not Hellenic, whereas the core lands of what would become the Byzantine Empire around the Aegean, etc., Asia Minor, etc., those were, there was never a force that had somewhat ethnically homogenized the place. So Isauria was what was in the previous century Illyria in a way. And the same goes for Osroene. It was in the Far East, as you know, basically the upper Tigris Valley, if I'm not wrong, was properly at the border of these were basically Persians. And there were mountaineers and other troops of, heavy Eastern military traditions and cultures and languages, right? So some of the most distant also from Romanity that you could think at that point. And it was taking shape, Romanity, properly as an identity. right? And that's the aforementioned Romania that Ambrose was supporting. It actually would survive mostly in what Romania was called in still in the Middle Ages, that is the Byzantine Empire, right? Yes, it survived in places like Romagna in Italy and all this, but to indicate that those were the Roman thing. But in the West, interestingly enough, there was none of this. Nobody talked about Romania. For other regions of Italy or Spain or Gaul, there was no such thing. This is deeply important, in my opinion, because those were the heartland of Romanity, and they decided to become not to become something else, but to recognize themselves in something else. Because for the rest, they were evidently, Romans in culture and identity and everything, but they still stood aside from these. So the more I go on with this story, from whichever perspective I see it, as a medievalist or studying ancient history, I realize how deep the divide was already, and it had always been, between the Latin and the Greek world. And by the way, in the East, this detachment also from this, say, between the city and the country and the interland, it was favoring in part the same state in some dimension, because while the center was in fact Constantinople, Thessalonica, these other, and also an eminently coastal centers, etc., in the interland there had always been populations that were not really considered Greek historically, right? Because the Greek world was the city, and there couldn't be anything else beyond it. That's how also properly the Hellenic mindset that survived strongly in the Byzantine one thought of itself as literally suspended somewhere in a sort of vacuum, as if even the Roman domination had not existed as such. And this is yet another aspect of the story. But especially as far as the recruitment of foreign troops was concerned, it was very useful, because somebody living, in fact, in a city like Thessalonica would have not been bothered by the barbarians until somebody came to make them rule the city, as it had happened. And it was becoming necessary in that circumstance. But as far as, as the Balkan interland was concerned, what did a Greek give a damn about it? Like, it properly did not exist. Lots of implications here, even for future Byzantine history and so on. In any case, Arbogast's alliance with the paganizing elements of the Roman Senate remains a typical trait of this period, right? This sort of senatorial paganizing reaction, which tells us how the late Roman senators, probably especially the Italic ones, took seriously that pagan education that was expressed beautifully, by the way, if you know the art of those times, in the care in which they emendated and reviewed the ancient texts in a sort of humanistic fervor, or a sort of renaissance that enlightened the otium of their splendid villas. These were very powerful individuals, by the way, because their latifundia were all intact still. Italy had not suffered. It wouldn't suffer until the 6th century, right? So they were necessary, as much as the church, to rule. And this brought, in fact, to an actual rebellion that spread from Italy to Gaul and Africa, where in part that Latinity lived in the same ways. I mean, Africa was overwhelmingly Romanized. The same is true for Gaul, especially in the south. So this was an aristocratic culture that believed to frame itself in a military state led by a barbarian, right? It took 2 years to put this thing down. Theodosius eventually marched against the rebels in 394, because he had come back in the east, and meanwhile he came back to Italy and defeated the rebel army on the famous battle of the Frigidus river, at properly the locks of the Alps, entering in Italy on September the 5th and the 6th of 394. This battle is extremely important from an ideological, political point of view in the history of the Roman Empire, because it basically sanctioned the Theodosian order over these attempts of restoration of previous orders, and kind of also paganizing, can't say pagan, comebacks this point. And that brought effectively the entire empire under a sole rule for good, except, as we will see, Theodosius died the following year, but he was calm because he had realized that basically the rebellious forces in the west had been tamed, been put down. Also, after the battle, a comprehensive reorganization would have been necessary, especially after this last pagan rise that was not just, a military usurper like Magnus Maximus from the north. This was about the relations between the empire and what was becoming ever more kind of eastern, not dominated but still managed empire, and the aristocracy of the old Rome. But Theodosius preferred that point a kind of exceptional provisional reorganization. In fact, he appointed, in the place of the Nicomax, a vices agens praefectorum praetorio et urbi, that was actually a pretty strange title. At least it had been drawn from the erudite repertoire of the equestrian offices of the 3rd century, right? So nothing that could be reconnected with the administrative one of the 4th century of Constantinian establishment of something that was closer to Theodosian policy. The 4th century had known the vices agens praefectorum praetorio, but not a praefectorum praetorio et urbi. And at the same time, and this office, however, was still well suited to substitute the Nicomax, father and son. And the father had killed himself, the true Roman death, let's say, when things went bad. And these were, in fact, provisional orders, right? That to which would have certainly followed if, had Theodosius lived a more stable, firm organization of this quite agitated and disrupted West. Consider still the question of the Eastern Illyricum, then that in the last years, we can say from 387-88, as we were saying before, had de facto belonged to the Pars Orientis. Did it have to come back to the west or remaining in the Pars Orientis? This had to be decided because, eventually Theodosius also had to split the empire between his two sons, and it would have been their problem, so he was interested anyway. However, Theodosius died on January the 17th, 395. Probably he died serenely, because he recommended the two sons, Arcadius, that was Augustus since 383, and Honorius, Augustus since 393, to his loyal general Stilicho. And it is known that Theodosius founded, in fact, great part of his policy on military loyalty. These generals of barbarian origin. And Stilicho had put down the Gothic rebellion. He was the right man. And Ambrose, the bishop that had dominated and admired Theodosius, at the same time said, almost to comfort himself and others of the sudden death of the emperor, "De filis nihil abebat novum quod conderet, nisi ut eos presenti commendaret parenti." That is to say, for the sons, for his sons, he didn't have anything to deliberate. It sufficed to entrust them to their parents, that here stands, in fact, a relative, literally, as Stilicho, that was present. And on the dynastic continuity, on the loyalty of the parents and Magister Utriusque Militiae, Magister Equitum and Magister Peditum Stilicho, rested the political building left by Theodosius. For today, we stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.